stand at the height of its eye, and the first thing you notice is that it is looking back at you. The most famous animal that ever lived is also the most misremembered one. Almost every confident thing you have been told about this animal, how fast it moved, what its arms were for, whether it wore feathers, whether it hunted at all, is either still being argued over in the literature, or has already been quietly overturned. This is not a film about how frightening it was, it is a film about how wrong the picture is. Everyone has seen the same sequence. The vehicle accelerating, the animal filling the mirror, gaining on it. It is the most famous shot in the history of dinosaur cinema, and it quietly asks a question the audience never asks back. What does that maneuver actually cost an animal weighing 7 tons? Running is not a matter of willpower or hunger, it is a matter of what bone can survive. Every stride in a true running gait drives a load through the leg that the skeleton has to absorb, and skeletons have limits, and limits do not negotiate. The legs were the evidence for the opposite conclusion. For decades, the long, slender lower limb segments were read as the signature of a fast animal, because in living animals that proportion usually does mean speed. Then a team combined 2 separate techniques, a full-body dynamic simulation of the gait, and a stress analysis of the bones while that gait was loading them, and asked a question nobody had put that way before. Could the skeleton survive the speeds the simulation was producing? It could not. True running gaits generated loads the leg bones would not have withstood. Put a number on it and the number arrives with a spread wide enough to be embarrassing. Earlier biomechanical models placed the top speed anywhere between about 5 and 15 meters per second, which is less an estimate than an admission. Once bone loading is imposed as a constraint, the upper half of that range falls away, and what is left for a full-grown adult is walking. A separate study came at it from the other end, treating the tail as a suspended mass with a natural rhythm, and got a preferred walking speed of roughly 4.5 kilometers an hour. A brisk human stroll. None of that makes it safe, and this is where the correction gets misread. A predator only has to be faster than what it is eating. The same reasoning that grounds this animal, mass against bone strength, applies to anything built at that scale, and the animals sharing its floodplain were built at that scale too. That extension is an inference rather than a measured result, so hold it loosely. But picture something enormous closing on you at the speed of a determined walk, from a direction you did not think to check, and the danger survives the demotion perfectly well. The arms are the punchline of a century of jokes, and the bone underneath the joke is genuinely odd. The upper arm bone is short but thickly walled, with heavy muscle attachment scars, and one influential study estimated the forelimb could curl something close to 200 kilograms. That reading is disputed now. A more recent analysis argues the thick wall is a side effect of how a rapidly growing animal builds its smallest limb bones, rather than evidence of strength, and points out that these particular bones turn up broken far more often than a genuinely load-bearing limb should. Measure them against the rest of the skeleton and the problem stops being muscular and becomes geometric. On one well-known mounted skeleton, the thigh bone is over 1 meter long and the skull is longer still, while the upper arm is barely 1/3 of a meter and the entire hand is shorter than your forearm. Work through the most generous possible range of motion at every joint, and the hand still cannot reach the mouth. It stops short by about the width of a dinner plate. It cannot reach the other hand, it cannot reach anything in front of the head. So the honest question is not what they were for. Every proposed use, pinning prey, signaling to mates, gripping during mating, pushing up off the ground, shares one fatal flaw. A longer arm would have done each of those jobs better, so none of them explains why the arm got shorter. The familiar answer is that the shrinking arm is simply the price of the growing head. One recent hypothesis goes further and proposes the reduction was actively selected, because several of these animals crowding one carcass meant anything protruding near those jaws risked being bitten off. Testable, and so far untested. The feathered image did not come from nowhere, and it did not come from an artist. It came out of the lake beds of northeastern China, where 3 skeletons of a large early relative were found with filaments preserved along the body, some of them longer than your hand. Here was a tyrant dinosaur, an animal you could not have lifted, wearing something recognizably like plumage. The scientists were more careful than the headlines. The covering is only partly preserved on all 3 specimens, so a patchier distribution cannot be ruled out. The point still stood. Enormous did not automatically mean bare. What we have for the famous animal itself is smaller and much less romantic. Across the whole family, the North American giants and their Asian cousin together, there are patches of preserved skin from the neck, the hips, the belly and the tail. They show small, plain, unornamented scales in irregular shapes, with no trace of a filament anywhere among them. It is a real result and a thin one, and the authors say so themselves. This is a handful of patches from an animal the size of a bus. Absence across a few hand widths is not absence everywhere. Put the two together, and the working reconstruction is a mostly scaly animal. The extensive feathering of the smaller, earlier relatives appears to have been lost long before this one existed, and the leading explanation is size itself. A body that large retains heat so well that an insulating coat turns from an asset into a liability, which is roughly what happened to elephants and rhinos. There is one more correction to the face. The soft tissue evidence around the jaws points to scaled lips closing over the teeth, closer to a monitor lizard than to the permanent exposed grin everybody draws. The scavenger argument deserves to be stated properly, because it was never a stupid idea. In its strongest form, it pointed at three things: hind limb proportions that do not match animals built to run, teeth shaped to crush and process bone rather than to slice flesh, and an enormous smell processing region inside the brain case, which is not rhetoric but a measurement. Those structures are larger in this family than body size alone predicts, meaning a genuinely acute nose. A nose like that finds carcasses across a floodplain. The difficulty is that a nose like that also finds living animals. Then somebody found an injury that had healed. Two tail vertebrae from a duck-billed dinosaur, fused together by a mass of overgrown reactive bone, with the crown of a tooth still lodged inside the join. The tooth was identified from its dimensions and the density of its serrations, and only one animal in that ecosystem is a match. Bone only grows back over an injury if the injured animal is still alive to grow it. So this one was bitten, and escaped, and lived long enough for its body to begin sealing the damage. A carcass cannot escape. The whole argument was built on a choice that does not exist in nature. Nothing large and carnivorous alive today is purely one thing or the other. Lions take a substantial share of their food from kills they did not make. Hyenas, the byword for scavenging, hunt most of what they eat. Vultures are the only real specialists, and they manage it only because they search from the air across enormous distances. For a walking animal weighing several tons, finding every meal already dead is not a strategy. It is a coin flip. Run daily, until the day you lose. What settles a question like this is the least glamorous evidence in the building. Bones with marks on them. A healed mark proves an attack. The prey survived. An unhealed mark stays silent, because it could equally be a hunt or a meal found already cold. Gather enough of both, and the picture that emerges is an animal that killed when killing was worth the risk, and ate what it stumbled across when it was not, which is exactly what large predators do now. If you want more of the vanished world, subscribe to The Earth Before. Look at the skull from the front, and both eye sockets are aimed the same way. In most large predatory dinosaurs, the eyes sit on the sides of a narrow head, which buys width of view and almost no overlap. This skull is broad across the back, while the snout narrows ahead of it, so both eyes take in the same patch of world at once. Someone mapped that overlap on sculpted reconstructions and found a binocular field wider than a hawk's. Depth perception, in other words. Knowing exactly how far away something is. That is a hunter's instrument. The bite is the one part of the reputation that survives intact, and even here the published figures are a mess. Estimates of the maximum force span a factor of more than 30, depending entirely on the method used to get them. The most careful recent study, which modeled individual teeth pressing into real bitten bone, lands well below the largest headline numbers. It also explains the thing that matters more than the total. Force concentrated on the tip of one thick tooth produces pressures far past what bone can resist, which is why this animal did something almost no predator does. It ate the skeleton. The life was short and violent, and we can read it directly. Growth rings in the bones of a series of individuals show an unremarkable juvenile that suddenly, in its early teens, starts adding around 2 kilograms a day, every day, for about 4 years, taking on the majority of its adult mass in that single burst. Then the growth flattens off, the skeleton finishes in its late teens, and the oldest individuals recovered were roughly 30 when they died. The largest one ever found weighed close to 9 tons, a fast childhood, a violent adolescence, a brief reign. Strip away everything the films added, and what remains is stranger than what was taken out, an animal that walked instead of sprinting, and did not need to sprint. Arms that were not a design failure, but the visible cost of a head that had taken over every job they might have done. Skin, rather than plumage, because it had grown too large to need a coat. Eyes that judged distance like a bird of prey. Jaws that ate bone. It lived hard for about 3 decades, and then it was gone.